everyone, welcome back to my channel for a brand new mystery with Mollie. If you are new around here, if you've never seen my face on your screen before, then hi, my name is Mollie and I post true crime videos like this every single week. So if you think that that is something that you might want to stick around for, then please do subscribe and don't forget to switch on the little notification bell so that YouTube will let you know whenever I post a new video. This week we are going to be talking about a solved case from Ohio when a 19-year-old girl just mysteriously vanished one night in November of 1983 and was later found murdered. Police's immediate inquiries meant focusing on her last known movements. Where had she been in the hours before her death? Who had she been seen with? As a result of these inquiries, they actually identified as many as 4 top suspects in this case, 4 men that they believed could have possibly been responsible for this homicide. The only issue was they just didn't know which one. They didn't have the solid concrete evidence to directly link any of them to the crime. It wouldn't be until more than 3 decades later when police could finally use something to advance this cold case that they didn't have in the original investigation: forensic science. When a DNA profile was obtained, they could finally discover which of their suspects was guilty and why they'd carried out this sickening crime. Join me as we delve into the shocking case of Janean Brown. But quickly before we get into the case, I would like to say a massive thank you to CyberGhost VPN for very kindly sponsoring this section of the video. CyberGhost is a VPN service, a virtual private networking service that allows you to browse the internet safely. It is essential for protecting your digital privacy because, you know, the internet can be a scary place. There are plenty of eyes watching you every time you go online. Hackers who may be looking to exploit your personal and private information, but CyberGhost VPN can help you with that. Using a VPN acts as like a barrier between you and the hackers because you can make it appear as though you are operating from another country. You simply select one of their 100+ locations before you browse to encrypt and reroute all of your traffic through secure servers, meaning that no one will know about your online activity. But aside from the safety aspect, using CyberGhost also means that you can unlock geo-restricted games and access content from over 40 streaming platforms. By changing your location, you can watch TV shows and movies on different countries' streaming services such as Netflix, Amazon Prime, Disney+. So for example, I always use CyberGhost to change my location to the US because I love to flick through the US Netflix. I just think they have a much better variety of shows than the UK Netflix. CyberGhost VPN is absolutely one of the best and most trusted VPN providers out there, with 38 million users worldwide and more than 20,000 excellent reviews on Trustpilot. It works on all major devices and operating systems like Windows, macOS, Android, iOS, and you can even protect up to 7 devices at the same time, so you can share it with your friends and family. So if you would like to try CyberGhost VPN yourself, then right now is the perfect time because I have an exclusive deal to share with you. If you use the link in the description box, you will get an incredible 84% discount plus 4 months free. That works out at just over $2 a month, which, I mean, is nothing, is it, to protect your online identity and personal data. And CyberGhost comes with a 45-day money-back guarantee, so you can try it risk-free. Thank you so much once again to CyberGhost VPN for sponsoring this video and supporting the channel. Thank you to all of you guys watching for always showing your support to the sponsors that we work with on this channel. And now let's just get into the case. But just before we continue, please listen carefully to the following. This video involves heavy themes such as sexual assault and rape. Viewer discretion is advised. So for this week's case, we are going back nearly 42 years ago now to November of 1983 in White House, which is a village located in Lucas County in the state of Ohio in the US. And this is Janean Brown. She was a young woman who in 1983 was living in Ohio. Janean Marie Brown was born on the 23rd of June 1964, making her 19 years old at the time this case occurred. She was actually raised by her grandparents. Their names were Edwin and Marjorie Cutliff Brown. According to one report, she was adopted by them shortly after she was born. As far as I'm aware, she had a happy, settled upbringing with her grandparents, and Janean was described as always being a very nice, caring, funny and ambitious young girl who was was full of life, had a real zest for life. Janine had been a student at the Penta County Vocational School. She graduated from there just the year prior in 1982. And it was after she left school that she started working as a nurse's aide in a local nursing home in White House, which she seemed to absolutely love. And the elderly residents there loved her. Again, Janine was a very, very caring person, very giving. So, I mean, clearly it was the perfect job for her. She was so good at looking after people. Janine had also moved out by the time this case took place. She was no longer living with her grandparents. She was actually living with her best friend. Her name was Pam Rader. And she and Janine had been best friends for years by this point, and they were extremely close. Pam actually said that people used to call her and Janine Laverne and Shirley, which was an old American sitcom. It was basically about two young women, two best friends who were also roommates, but they were very different from one another. They were the polar opposite, and that was Janine and Pam to a T. Pam said that Janine was always the more quiet and reserved one, whereas she was the opposite. She could be very outspoken and a bit mouthy at times. So they were the total opposites of each other, like night and day, but still they were best friends. They just adored each other so much. They were inseparable. So inseparable, in fact, that, yeah, they decided to live together. Janine moved into a house with both Pam and Pam's older brother. His name was Larry. And this living arrangement seemed to work really well. Pam and Janine loved being roommates and just loved spending time together in general. They would often go out together in White House, go for a drink and socialize with other young people, which actually happens to be exactly what the two young women had been doing on the day that this case occurred. It was Thursday, the 17th of November, 1983. And that evening, Pam and Janine left their home and they decided to go to their local bar in White House, the Copper Lantern, which was only a short walk away from where they lived. They had some drinks, played a game of pool, got chatting to the other people in the bar, and Janine also spent a lot of time with her 26-year-old boyfriend, who was also in the Copper Lantern that night. His name was Harold Easter, although a lot of people called him Big Dog, apparently. I think he was quite big and muscly. He was kind of one of those guys that drew a lot of attention from girls. A lot of the local girls had a bit of a crush on Harold, but he and Janine had been dating for about a month or so, so it was a fairly new relationship, but Janine was smitten with him. She had really, really strong feelings for Harold, so you can imagine her heartbreak when later that same night she saw her boyfriend Harold kissing another girl. Pam and Janine had spent a couple of hours in the Copper Lantern bar. They seemed to have a really good time, and then when they decided to leave around 2:15 a.m, so the early hours of the morning on the 18th of November, Janine said goodbye to her boyfriend Harold. However, as she was walking away from the Copper Lantern, she quickly glanced back to where Harold was, and that was when she saw one of the barmaids of the Copper Lantern, a young woman named Loretta, kissing Harold Eastep on the lips. Now, Harold would later claim that this kiss was very much one-sided, I guess. It took him by surprise just as much as it took Janine by surprise. He said that he was just walking out of the bar when Loretta ran up to him and kissed him, and he had no idea that she was going to do that. He said that he barely even knew Loretta. But of course, again, this was heartbreaking for Janine to see. She shouted to Harold, quote, "What are you doing?" But before he could really answer, she jumped in the car with Pam and immediately went back home, very, very upset and distraught by what she had just seen. However, when they did get home, Janine didn't actually stay there for very long. She just couldn't calm down. She was still so upset. And she started saying to Pam that she needed to go. She needed to go and speak to Harold immediately about that kiss. And Pam offered to go with her, but Janine said no. She said that she was fine going on her own. She grabbed Pam's White House cheerleading jacket, put that on, and walked out of the house. But unbeknownst to Pam, that would actually be the very last time that she would ever see her best friend alive again. The following morning, Pam woke up and she realised that Janine wasn't home. She'd never come back the previous night, and Pam didn't really think too much of this initially. I mean, she knew that Janine had gone to see her boyfriend Harold, so she figured that they must have made up and that Janine stayed with him, and she expected Janine to be home later to get ready for her shift at the nursing home, as she was due to be working later that day. But oddly, she never did. Janine never came back, and she never turned up for work either. And it was then when Pam started to worry. This was very, very out of character for Janine. She would never just not show up for work. She loved her job at the nursing home. So again, thinking that Janine was still with Harold, Pam picked up the phone and she called him. But to her shock, Harold informed Pam that no, Janine wasn't with him. In fact, he hadn't seen her since they left the Copper Lantern the previous evening, and Janine saw him kissing Loretta. So as you can imagine, it was at this point when the alarm bells started to ring for Pam. Janine had left the house in the early hours to go and see Harold, but Harold was saying that Janine never came over. He had no idea where she was. So what on earth had happened to Janine? What had happened to her that meant that she never arrived at Harold's house? So as Harold didn't know where she was, Pam started ringing around her and Janine's other friends and her family, asking if any of them had seen her, but no one had. And so with no luck there, Pam picked up the phone again, but this time to call 911 and report her best friend Janine Brown as missing. Now it seems as though police were quite dismissive of this report initially, telling Pam that Janine hadn't really been missing for long enough for them to dispatch officers out to look for her, and that she should just wait for Janine to return home. But of course Pam wasn't going to do that. She knew that something had to be wrong, and so she started searching for her best friend herself, going to all of the areas and places around White House that she and Janine would go to see if she could find her, but there was nothing. No sign of Janine anywhere. It was as if she had just vanished into thin air. But the mystery surrounding Janine Brown's sudden disappearance wouldn't remain a mystery for very long. Just the day after Pam filed the missing persons report, Lucas County Police received another report, this time that a dead body had been found. On the morning of the 19th of November 1983, a couple were out walking along Archbold White House Road in White House towards this remote field/wooded area when they stumbled upon blood. They noticed like a little pool of blood in the grass. Their immediate thought was that this blood had come from an animal. Maybe a deer had been hit by a car, or someone had been deer hunting nearby or something. So they carried on walking. They walked past the blood, but they didn't get very far before they spotted something else on the ground. It was a pair of women's underwear, some black-coloured women's underwear, and they also spotted what looked like almost drag marks in the grass and the leaves, as if someone had been pulling something along the ground or pulling someone. So they carried on looking around and they found something else, something which was even more sinister. In a drainage ditch nearby, they noticed what looked like a mound of dirt and mud and leaves, which did not look natural at all. And when they looked closer, to their horror, they realised that there was a human leg sticking out of this mound. They'd found a makeshift grave. Someone had been buried underneath this mound of dirt. So extremely panicked, the couple immediately contacted the police, who were quickly at the scene, where they began unearthing this body. It was soon determined to have been the body of a young woman. She'd been buried only a couple of feet under the dirt, and it was very clearly a quick job. Someone was obviously in a rush burying this body. Of course, police knew that foul play had been involved here. This woman, whoever she was, had clearly been murdered, and it was quite clear just from looking at her body how exactly she had been killed. It was a knife wound to her neck. Her throat had been slit with a knife, and chillingly, this knife wound was so long and so deep along her throat that this poor woman was nearly decapitated. That's how vicious this injury was. She also had abrasions and bruises on her body, which were later determined to have come from like a man's bout where she had been whipped. She'd been whipped with a bout. She had self-defense injuries on her hands where she tried to put up a fight. She was virtually naked in the grave. Most of her clothing had been removed, and as we know, her black underwear was found nearby, suggesting a sexual motive to this crime. And sure enough, when her autopsy was performed, it was confirmed that she had been raped. It was just unimaginable, the terror that this young woman was subjected to by whoever had killed her. Again, this was such a vicious, callous murder. But who was she? Who was this victim? Obviously, upon finding her, the police's #1 priority was identifying her, and it didn't take very long for them to do so. Buried around her body, the police also unearthed a jacket which had White House cheerleaders written on the back, and in the pocket of this jacket was a packet of cigarettes, Merit cigarettes. And it was upon finding this jacket and looking into missing people reports that had recently been filed in White House that detectives realised that this murdered young woman must have been 19-year-old Janean Brown. She'd been reported missing by her best friend Pam just the day before this. Pam said that the last time she saw Janean, she'd been wearing her White House cheerleader's jacket. That's what she left the house in, so police knew that this was Janean. And the Merit cigarettes in the jacket pocket were apparently the brand of cigarettes that Janean was known to smoke. So with the discovery of Janean's body, Lucas County Police launched a homicide investigation to try and catch her killer. To begin their inquiries, police's first port of call was to put together a timeline here, piece together Janean's movements on the night that she was killed, and this meant taking a thorough statement from her best friend Pam. Pam obviously told the police about what she and Janean had been up to the evening before Janean vanished, that they'd gone out for some drinks and to play pool at the Copper Lantern. She told them about how Janean had become upset after witnessing her boyfriend Harold kissing the barmaid Loretta when they were leaving the Lantern, and how after getting home she immediately went back out to confront Harold about the kiss, and that was the last time that Pam ever saw her. So naturally, upon learning this, police already had a top suspect, Janean's boyfriend, 26-year-old Harold Easter. I mean, she was going to see Harold that night. She was going to confront him. Is it possible that this could have led to an argument between them? Maybe it turned physical. Harold turned physical, and the argument escalated and ended with Harold murdering his own girlfriend. Apparently, Harold Easter was known to have a bit of a temper. He could be quite hot-headed at times, so he did seem like a very viable suspect to the police. So detectives went to speak to Harold, interview him about the murder of his girlfriend, Janean Brown. Harold completely denied it, said that he had nothing to do with Janean's death, and he claimed that he didn't even see her again after they left the Copper Lantern that night. He told the police that he'd gone to stay at his sister's house that evening after leaving the bar, and that Janean never came over, which his sister did confirm. She said that Janean never came round and that Harold never left after returning from the bar. Now, understandably, this wasn't the strongest of alibis for police, because there is every chance that Harold's sister could have been lying in order to protect him, could have been giving him a false alibi, so they couldn't rule him out as a suspect based on this. But equally, there was nothing concrete tying him directly to Janean's murder, so he couldn't be eliminated, but also police were forced to move on and look into other men as well. Harold was kind of put to one side for now, and so the police began looking into the rest of the people, the rest of the men who were also in the Copper Lantern on the night that Janean was there. Is there a chance that any of them could have been the perpetrator? They took a statement from the barmaid Loretta, the same barmaid that had kissed Harold, and I think she admitted that she had been a bit flirty with Harold. She did fancy him, and she did run up to him and give him a kiss, which he wasn't expecting at all. But anyway, she was able to tell the police who else had been in the bar that night while she was working. White House was quite a small village in Ohio, and so the majority of the time, people who came in the Copper Lantern were regulars, the same people that Loretta would see most nights, and so she was able to give the detectives a list of other men that had been there at the same time as Janean. So police started going through this list, and they identified a couple more potential suspects. The first was Larry Rader, who, if you remember, was the older brother of Janean's best friend, Pam Rader, who also lived with Janean and Pam. The three of them, Larry, Pam and Janean, shared the house. Larry too had been drinking in the Copper Lantern on the night in question, and it it transpires that he was actually a former love interest of Janine Brown's. They had dated for a while before Janine started dating Harold. In fact, Larry's sister Pam did say that Janine only really started dating Harold because she kind of wanted to make Larry feel a bit jealous. It was clear that there was still some feelings there. Janine still had some feelings for Larry, at least when she very first began dating Harold. And Larry seemed to feel the same. He still had feelings for Janine, so you know, could this have been a motive? Was he jealous? Jealous that Janine was dating Harold and decide to kill her because in his eyes, if he couldn't have Janine, then no one could. So police asked Larry for his movements on the night of Janine's death, and he confirmed that he had been in the Copper Lantern that same evening, although he'd actually gotten there before Pam and Janine arrived, and therefore he arrived home before them too. Larry said that he was pretty drunk by the time he got home, and so he just kind of passed out on the couch. He fell asleep, and he was home sleeping when Pam and Janine later returned, and when Janine left again to go and see Harold. And Pam confirmed that. She confirmed that, yeah, her brother was fast asleep when she and Janine returned, and that he stayed in the house all night. He was in the house during the time that Janine disappeared and was murdered. But the police had the same issue with Larry as they did with their previous suspect, Harold. The fact that, again, it was his sister who was backing up his account, and therefore police couldn't be 100% certain that this was the truth because, again, Pam could have been possibly trying to cover for Larry, even though she was also Janine's best friend. So that was yet another suspect that police couldn't really definitively rule in or out. But the list of people of interest in Janine's case continued to grow. The barmaid also informed the police that another individual by the name of Bill Heisinger was also in the Copper Lantern that night. Bill apparently had the nickname Crazy Horse around town, and he became a suspect in the police's eyes because Bill was apparently a survivalist. He had a hobby of practicing outdoor survival skills. He had a very, very strong interest in knives. He also had a criminal record of, I believe, drug-related offences. And again, he had been in the bar that night. So police spoke to Bill about Janine's case. He said that, yep, he had been in the Lantern on the same night as Janine, but he said that he left on his own and that he didn't see Janine again after leaving the bar, and he had no idea who had killed her, no involvement in her death. Bill said that he went home alone that night, meaning that there was no one that could verify his alibi. So police now had this third suspect, Bill Heisinger, that once again they couldn't rule out. It was difficult for the police because, of course, this was the early 80s when DNA and forensic science just wasn't a thing yet, or at least it was in its very, very, very early days. They did have Janine's killer's DNA. As we know, Janine had been raped by her attacker, and traces of his semen were recovered during her rape kit, but they couldn't do anything with this evidence at the time. They just didn't have the forensic technology at their disposal to be able to compare it to their suspects to see if there was a match, because that technology just didn't exist yet, hence why it was so hard for police to eliminate these suspects that they did have. But in an effort to try and get some more information in the case, some more tips and leads, the police appealed to the public for information, and news of Janine's case did spread very quickly. Her case was picked up by the media, television stations started reporting on it, Janine's best friend Pam even appeared on the news to talk about Janine's case and her last night alive, and thanks to all of this media coverage, a very significant tip did come in. It was a tip that was actually reported by a male resident of the nursing home where Janine worked in White House. His name was Chester, and he came forward to the police and actually told them that he had seen Janine on the evening that she vanished. Chester was kind of known as being a bit of a night owl. He would often be out walking around the nursing home in the early hours. The nursing home was only about a quarter of a mile away from where Janine lived, by the way. Anyway, Chester said that he had been out walking around in the early hours of the 18th of November when he saw Janine also walking along the street alone. Now, I don't think he could be 100% certain what time this was. He believed it was somewhere between like 3 to 4 a.m. But he said that he saw Janine walking, and so they stopped and had a brief conversation before Janine carried on walking. And as she was walking away, Chester saw this brown coloured van pull up nearby. He watched as Janine walked up to the passenger side door of the van, clearly spoke to the person who was driving, and then she opened the door and got inside. And that sighting of Janine getting into the brown van was the last of her. The last time it seems anyone saw her alive. So who was driving this brown van? Unfortunately, Chester couldn't really get a good look at the driver from where he was standing, and also because it was dark outside, but it seemed likely that the driver may have had something to do with Janine's murder. And guess what police discovered? One of their 3 suspects did actually own a brown coloured van. It was Bill Heisinger. So police decided to search his van, see if they could find anything in there, any evidence that connected him to Janine's murder. They did collect some carpet fibres from his van to see if they could match any of these fibres to anything that had been found on Janine's body or her clothing, but they couldn't, to be honest. This was a bit of a dead end. And whilst they didn't find anything in the van to incriminate Bill, just the fact that he owned a brown van in itself did mean that he was still very much one of the police's top suspects. But Bill Heisinger wasn't the only individual that the police came across that owned a brown van. Another man who was in the Copper Lantern on the night of Janine's killing also had one too. His name was Andy Gustafson. Andy Gustafson was 25 years old at this point in 1983. He was a local and an acquaintance of Janine's. I don't think they were necessarily friends, but they were friendly. They knew of each other. To be honest, most people who knew Andy Gustafson just thought of him as being a bit of a spoiled brat, really. He came from a very wealthy family. He had a very privileged upbringing. His father was the CEO of this big successful company in Ohio called Dana Corporation. So he had a lot of money that his son Andy would kind of flaunt and show off. He was just quite an arrogant guy, was Andy, clearly the type that thought that he was just better than everyone else because his family were well off. And like I said, he was in the bar on the same night that Janine was there, and it was actually reported that he'd made an inappropriate sexual comment about Janine. He'd commented on how he thought she had a, quote, cute butt. So, you know, clearly he was attracted to her. And again, he also owned a brown van, the same kind of van that Janine was seen getting into on the night that she vanished and was killed. And so police decided to conduct a search of Andy's van too. And whilst they didn't find any, like, blood or anything like that in there, what they did discover on the floor in Andy's van was a cigarette butt. A Merit cigarette butt, which piqued the detectives' interest because, as we know, Janine Brown smoked Merit cigarettes. In fact, she had that packet of Merit cigarettes in her jacket pocket when she was found dead. So, had this cigarette butt in Andy's van come from Janine? Did she get in his brown van that night and smoke a cigarette in there? Police asked Andy about this, and he said that no, that hadn't happened. He was adamant that Janine hadn't gotten into his van at any point that night. And in fact, he even said that that couldn't have been possible anyway, because he was already back at his home at the time that the nursing home resident Chester saw Janine getting into the van. As we discussed, Chester said that he believed it was sometime between 3 to 4 a.m. and Andy said that he was already home by 3 a.m. that night, which apparently his wife did confirm. Although, once again, I sound like a broken record at this point, but the fact that his alibi was also backed up by a family member, his wife, meant that he couldn't be ruled out based on this statement from his wife alone. So Andy Gustafson too remained on the list of suspects. I mean, mean, that was something that the police weren't short on at all in this case. Suspects, they had 4 very viable suspects in their investigation. Harold Eastep, Larry Rader, Bill Heisinger, and Andy Gustafson. 4 people that they hadn't been able to rule out, and they were pretty convinced that one of these 4 men had to have been the killer, but they just didn't know which one. They had no solid, hard, concrete evidence against any of them, and so none of them could be arrested. And unfortunately, because of this, because of a lack of evidence, the case of Janean Brown just started to go cold. Weeks, months, and even years started to pass by with nothing. No significant developments in the case, no arrests made, and no justice for Janean. But Janean's best friend Pam never gave up. For years after her best friend's death, she continued to try and spread awareness about Janean's case, continued to press the police to look back into it. Pam said that after Janean died at her funeral, she made a promise to her best friend that she would never stop. She would never let anyone forget Janean and never give up on trying to find the man who did this to her and bring him to justice. And it was in 2011, so about 28 years after Janean's murder, when Pam's tireless campaigning finally paid off, because 2011 was the year that Janean's case was kind of reopened by a cold case team of detectives with the Lucas County Police Department. Detectives Jay Gast and Tom Ross were leading the investigation, and they started basically going over everything again with fresh pairs of eyes, going over Janean's old case file, going over old statements, old leads, old evidence, old suspects. And of course, by this point, the police had something that they didn't have back in 1983. They finally had DNA science. It had come such a long way since Janean's homicide, so they were hopeful that they would be able to use it to massively progress Janean's cold case. In the spring of 2013, the detectives sent the old samples that had been taken during Janean Brown's rape kit to the lab for testing, and they were very concerned, to be honest, that nothing would really come from these tests because, you know, it had been about 3 decades since Janean's murder, and DNA can degrade over time. So they were worried that any DNA on these rape kit swabs would have just deteriorated by now. But thankfully, they hadn't, and scientists were able to obtain a male DNA profile from these swabs. After all these years, they had the DNA profile of Janean Brown's killer. This was a huge breakthrough. And of course, what did detectives want to do as soon as they had this DNA profile? Compare it to the 4 top suspects that had been identified very early on in the investigation. Harold, Larry, Bill, and Andy, to see if the original investigators were right, if one of these 4 men really was the killer. So, decades after the crime, police set out to find each of these 4 men and asked them for a voluntary DNA sample. They found Bill Heisinger, asked him for his DNA, he willingly gave it over. They found Harold Eastep, Janean's boyfriend at the time. He also willingly gave over his DNA. Unfortunately, Larry Rader, Pam Rader's brother, was actually dead himself by this point. He'd passed away a couple of years earlier in 2009. Apparently, Larry became an alcoholic after Janean's death. It affected him that much. He struggled with her murder so much because, like I said earlier, they had dated before, and Larry still very much had feelings for Janean. He still loved her. So when she was murdered, Pam said that it broke him. He was so devastated, and so he turned to drink. He turned to alcohol to try and cope with his grief, and Pam said that Larry just ultimately drank himself to death. But he was still a suspect in the case. Police still needed his DNA, and so they asked for the Rader family's permission to exhume Larry Rader's body in order to obtain a DNA sample from his remains so that they could test that against the perpetrator's DNA, which was really hard for the Rader family, as you can imagine. They didn't want to give police that permission. They didn't want to disturb Larry's final resting place, but also they wanted to clear his name. He'd been a suspect in Janean's murder for years and years, which must have just tormented him and the family. And yeah, they finally finally wanted to prove that he was innocent, finally wanted to clear his name, and so they allowed the police to exhume his body and they collected Larry's DNA sample. And so that just left the fourth and final suspect, Andy Gustafson, who was living in Michigan by this point. So police travelled to Michigan and asked him if he would provide a voluntary sample of his DNA so that he could finally be 100% eliminated as a suspect in the Janean Brown cold case. However, Andy Gustafson refused. He was the only one out of the 4 suspects that refused to give his DNA. I mean, apart from Larry Rader, who was, of course, dead. But yeah, Andy just straight up said no, he was not giving his DNA sample. He maintained that he did not kill her, said that she did not get into his van on the night of her death, but still he did not want to give a sample to prove it. And he told the police that they would have to go through his lawyer in order to speak to him any further about this. He was very closed off, refused to cooperate, which naturally for the police spoke volumes. Harold Estep and Bill Heisinger and Larry Rader's family were more than happy to give police their DNA. They wanted the comparisons to be made so that they could be finally cleared as suspects. So why wasn't Andy Gustafson's reaction the same? If he really was innocent, he really did not commit this crime, why wouldn't he want to prove it by giving his sample? So because of this, Gustafson pretty much instantly rose to the very top of the suspect list. Police really started to believe that out of all 4 men, he was the likely murderer, and this belief just kind of cemented even more for them when the results came back from the lab. Police sent Bill Heisinger's, Harold Estep's and Larry Rader's DNA off for comparison, and the results came back that none of them were a match. None of these 3 men matched the DNA profile that had been obtained from Janean Brown's rape kit. None of them matched the DNA of the offender. So finally, after all these years, after living under this cloud of suspicion for 3 decades, they could actually be ruled out. And so who did that leave? Andy Gustafson, the self-entitled and arrogant rich kid who, if you remember, had made that sexual comment about Janean whilst they were in the copper-lantern on the night of her death. The comment about how she had a cute butt. Andy Gustafson was around 25 years old back in 1983. So by this point in 2013, he was in his mid-50s. He was married, he had children, I think he even had grandchildren, and he seemed to be living a relatively normal life in Michigan. But of course that was all about to change, as police were now certain that he was a killer, a cold-blooded killer, and they were determined to try and prove it. But how? How were they going to do that if he refused to give his DNA? They couldn't force him to give his DNA because they didn't have like a warrant or anything to get it. They were going to have to figure out how else they could link Andy to the crime without getting his DNA sample. So police basically went over the old case file again, specifically looking at everything to do with Andy Gustafson in the file. And that was when they realised something. They remembered that back in 1983, when Janean Brown was killed, police had conducted a search of Andy Gustafson's brown van, and inside they'd found a Merit cigarette butt, which they believed may have come from Janean as she smoked Merit cigarettes. And after all these years, police still had that cigarette butt. It had been kept in storage all this time. Obviously, back in the early 80s, they couldn't do anything with this cigarette butt, but now in 2013, they had forensic science at their disposal. So they sent this cigarette butt to the lab for testing, and guess whose DNA they found on it? Janean Brown's. Janean's DNA was found on this cigarette butt, proving that she had smoked it, and also proving that Andy Gustafson had lied. For years, he had absolutely denied that Janean had been in his brown van. She was not in his van on the night of her death. But this cigarette butt now proved otherwise. Police now finally had some solid evidence to link him to the crime. Well, kind of. Yes, this was very damning evidence, but I guess it wasn't necessarily direct evidence to tie Gustafson to the murder. murder. Again, it was evidence that he had lied to the police, but the cigarette butt just proved that Janean had been inside his vehicle. It didn't necessarily prove that he was the one who killed her, so detectives knew that they would need more than that in order to prosecute him. They still needed that DNA sample from Gustafsson himself to compare against the semen that was collected from Janean's rape kit. And eventually they had a stroke of luck, because upon delving into Andy Gustafsson's background, upon looking further into his past, the detectives actually learned that years earlier in 2007, Andy Gustafsson had been looked at as a suspect in another unrelated case which had happened in Lucas County. He'd been accused of the sexual assault of another young woman. Now, I'm actually not sure whatever happened with that case, whether he was found to be responsible for that crime or not, but regardless, his DNA was taken back then in 2007 when that case occurred. So they had Gustafsson's DNA swabs just in that case file. So when they realised this, the detectives investigating Janean's cold case took Andy's swabs and immediately sent them to the lab for comparison. And when the results came back, they confirmed what the police already knew. Sure enough, Andy Gustafsson was the killer. His DNA was found to be an exact match to the DNA of Janean Brown's murderer. After 3 decades, they had successfully identified the perpetrator, and so they moved in to arrest him. On the 6th of June 2013, Gustafsson was arrested on suspicion of murder, and he was taken in for questioning. During his interview, he once again denied his involvement, denied having anything to do with the killing of Janean Brown, denied again that she'd been in his van on the night of her death. And before they confronted Andy with the DNA match, they asked him if he'd had sex with Janean. Not if he had killed her, but if he had had sex with her on the night that she died. And this was a very important question for the police to ask, because they knew that his answer could possibly present them with a problem, because the evidence that they had linking him to the crime was obviously semen, his semen being recovered from Janean's body. But if he claimed that he and Janean had had sex on the night that she was killed, consensual sex, then his defense could use that during a possible upcoming trial. They could claim that there was no actual evidence to prove that he killed Janean, just that he had slept with her that night. Whereas if he denied having slept with her and still maintained that she didn't get in his van, well, that would be a jackpot moment, wouldn't it? Police would have caught him out. And so they asked Gustafsson if he'd had sex with Janean on the night of her death, or if he'd ever had sex with her. And once again, his answer was no, which police could obviously prove was yet another lie. He had had sex with her, but I mean, it wasn't sex, was it? It was rape. He'd raped her. Eventually, Andy's interview ended when he asked for an attorney and he refused to answer any more questions. But regardless, he was charged with murder. It was the police's belief, their theory, that this crime was, of course, sexually motivated. We know from that inappropriate comment that Gustafsson had made about Janean on the night of her death that he was very attracted to her, commenting on how he thought she had a cute butt. And so it's believed that later that night, in the early hours of Friday the 18th of November 1983, he was just driving along the streets in his brown van when he saw Janean Brown out walking. He decided to stop and offer her a lift. As we know, she was headed to see her boyfriend Harold that night, and so perhaps when Andy stopped and started chatting to Janean near the nursing home, he offered to take Janean to Harold's house, and so she happily accepted this lift. She happily got into his vehicle. She'd obviously smoked one of her cigarettes while she was in his van. They were chatting and I guess everything seemed fine, but then it's believed that at some point Andy probably tried to come on to Janean, probably tried to initiate sex between them, but Janean wasn't interested. She said no. But Andy had decided that he wasn't going to take no for an answer, so he kept trying to touch her, kept trying to initiate sex. She started trying to fight him off, and it's believed that she probably opened the car door and started trying to run away from Andy, but he ran after her. She was running towards that remote wooded area along Archbold White House road where her body was later found. But when Andy caught up to her, he launched the most horrendous and violent attack. He started beating Janine, whipping her with his belt. He raped her, and then he pulled out a knife and slashed her throat, inflicting such a deep wound that he nearly decapitated Janine, and she died. And then he tried to cover up the crime. He attempted to quickly bury her body in the shallow makeshift grave, and then he just went home and acted as though nothing had ever happened. It's believed that he lied to his wife when he returned. She woke up and asked him what time it was when he arrived home, and he told her that it was 3 a.m. but it wasn't. It was a lot later than that. He'd obviously lied to try and give himself an alibi, and then he just carried on with his life as normal, clearly completely unfazed by what he had done. The fact that he had cruelly taken the life of an innocent young woman, and he got away with it for so long. For 30 years he could just live a normal happy life as a free man, until finally DNA science caught up to him. Now, despite the fact that he was initially charged with murder, when it came to his court proceedings he actually made a plea deal with prosecutors, and in December of 2014 he pleaded guilty not to the murder of Janine Brown, but the manslaughter, and also he pleaded guilty to felony rape in the 1st degree. I'm not gonna lie, it kind of baffles me that prosecutors even agreed to this plea deal, to be honest. How this could be seen as manslaughter. He literally whipped Janine with a belt and slit her throat. Not sure how that's not considered a cold-blooded murder. Maybe they just thought that the case was too risky to take to trial, I have no idea. But for whatever reason, they agreed to this deal. He pleaded guilty to manslaughter and felony rape, and in December of 2014, Andy Gustafsson was sentenced to 15 years in prison in total. 10 years for the manslaughter charge and 5 years for the rape charge. Janine's brother Michael said that for the family, the length of Gustafsson's sentence wasn't necessarily what was important to them. It was more so the admission. They wanted that admission of guilt from Andy, that confession that he was responsible for Janine's death. And by him pleading guilty, I guess they did get that, even if it was guilty of manslaughter. Andy Gustafsson is still in prison to this day. I believe he is incarcerated at the North Central Correctional Facility in Marion in the state of Ohio. And according to sources, he could become eligible for parole in 2028, which is quite terrifying as that is just a couple of years away, but yeah. That brings us to the end of this case. That concludes the case of Janine Brown. Janine was only 19 years old, barely even an adult. She had such a bright future ahead of her, I'm sure, but it was all cruelly snatched away by a man who just couldn't take no for an answer. A very, very, very tragic case. But yeah, that is it for this case. As always, please do let me know your thoughts and opinions on the case down below in the comments. I would love to hear what you guys think. And also feel free to let me know of any other case suggestions that you would like to see me cover on this channel. Again, you can pop them in the comments below, or alternatively you can go through my case request form, which is always linked in the description box. A quick thank you once again to CyberGhost VPN for sponsoring this video, and a reminder that you can get an incredible 84% off plus 4 months free when you go through my link in the description box. Thank you all so much for watching. Please do give this video a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you again next week for another mystery with Mollie. Bye.